Same-sex marriage will be legal in Illinois, but pension problems remain. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. A lot has been happening in Springfield, and of course, in some ways, a lot hasn't been happening. So we have a little bit of both today. And to discuss that, experts in their fields. Mike Lawrence is here. Again, he is, in addition to many other things, former director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Welcome back, Mike.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program for those eager graduate students learning how to be fine journalists at University of Illinois Springfield. Welcome back, Charlie.
Thank you, Bernie.
And speaking of fine journalists, Bruce Rushton of Illinois Times, a writer with them in Springfield. Welcome, Bruce.
Always a pleasure.
Same-sex marriage. I think, Charlie, I think you had said in the past this was eventually going to pass. Perhaps others at the table did as well. Thoughts on how it passed and what it means for the state from this time forward? As we know, the House passed it. It's going to take effect unless something changes with further legislative action in January, June 1st, and the governor has said he will sign it as we tape this show.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, he said that he would sign it by the end of the month. It was a very dramatic, historic vote. There were personal stories told, the kind you generally don't hear in debate in the legislature. There was a tragedy that we'll probably talk about a little later involving Representative Naomi Jacobson. But it was, as I've said before, and you alluded to, it was something that was going to happen sooner or later. The trend is pretty clear in this country. When Quinn signs the bill, we will be the 15th state plus the District of Columbia to recognize same-sex marriages. The polling data suggests that the most opposition occurs with people my age, and there's much less opposition among people Bruce's age or younger. And so just as times change, attitudes changed. And Mike and I have both been around long enough, we can remember back when the issue of just not discriminating against people because of their sexual orientation, legislation introduced to prohibit that, and it was kind of a laughing stock. People made jokes about it. Of course we're going to bash gays. I mean, what's more all-American than going after people who are homos? You know, that was kind of the attitude. And so you look at the evolution. Illinois, a decade or so ago, said, no, you can't discriminate against people solely because of their sexual orientation. And then we legalized civil unions, and now less than, 2 years, around 2-3 years later, we've fully recognized that marriage is a relationship between two committed people. And as far as the state of Illinois is concerned, it doesn't matter if they're the same sex or of different sexes. What matters is the fact that here are two people who want to commit themselves to sharing their lives, to death do us part, as they say.
I have to say that there were, the veto session was 2 3-day periods, and during the first one, there was a pro same-sex marriage or marriage equality rally, and then the next day there was an anti, and they call it, keep marriage sacred kind of rally. A lot of religious fervor. I ended up covering that one. It was my assignment that day in addition to other things I do. It was 2 hours of speeches. We had a couple of candidates for governor who gave, Kirk Dillard in particular, a pretty strong speech. We must protect children from this. There was very strong language that a lot of it was religious in nature. God has ordained man and woman. So I'm wondering, perhaps, Mike, political ramifications of this now that Illinois has passed it. Do you think the opponents will forget this, or will it fall out of the governor's race or races for political office? Or, for example, the 3 Republicans in the Illinois House who voted for it, 2 of whom I think are facing re-election campaigns and one of whom is running for state treasurer, Tom Cross. Are there ramifications for them in Republican primaries or in the election?
Well, as you indicated, if there are ramifications, it could be primarily in the primary. Although, as I've said before on an earlier show, I think Senator Dillard's remarks at this rally you alluded to of the people who were opposing this legislation could cost him some support in the primary initially, because my view is that there may have been Democrats and independents who are not fans of Governor Quinn who might have crossed over into the primary, and Dillard has had the reputation of being a moderate, and this certainly changes that reputation in some respects. Then in the general election, if he is successful in the primary, I think it could have an impact in the general election as well.
Interesting. I did talk to him after the vote because I saw him in the rotunda, and I said, does this kind of take it off the table for the election? He said, I think we can concentrate now on making Illinois, a destination economy and talk about jobs. And because this is done, although he still doesn't like what he had called some unconstitutional stuff in this bill, he worried, for example, that the Catholic Conference lost its contract with the state to provide foster care and adoption after civil unions passed, and he wasn't sure if he was going to promote legislation at this point to undo that. So there will still be some things, but there's clearly, and Bill Brady, the other conservative Republican candidate for governor who was at that rally, also always stresses, well, people care mostly about jobs, and we want to stress jobs.
Well, I do think it can diminish the importance of the issue because it's been resolved for the most part. I mean, there's been talk among the Republican candidates about whether they would repeal this law if they're elected governor. I think the chances of the legislature voting to repeal the law are, to say the least, not great at this point. So there may be some discussion of this issue in the primary and in direct mail pieces to try to rally conservatives to one candidate or another in the primary. But I think the issue will be less important, but it may be a factor with at least some voters. And if you have close primary election or a close general election, it could be more of a factor.
See, go ahead, Bruce.
I guess, I'm looking at this, I agree with you, it's just such a sea change from what we've seen in the American political spectrum over the last couple decades or so. I think that same-sex marriage was used in a lot of places by the Republican Party 20 years ago to get single-issue voters out to get their folks elected.
As George W. was getting elected.
Absolutely. And I just don't think I think we're onto a different ballgame now. And so I would be skeptical that this is something that still has legs after 20 years plus of debate. I think that people have a lot of folks, the body politic, the majority, have moved on, and I think that the folks who say that folks are, the electorate is mainly concerned about jobs and the economy are probably dead right. So.
But I would add that, and I agree, the economy is certainly more important than the question of who can get married. But if you're Pat Quinn and you're running against a Kirk Dillard or a Bill Brady, are your advisors going to tell you, well, let's talk about how great Illinois is economically, and let's talk about how we have the second highest unemployment rate in the nation? Are we going to talk about how my opponent is a bigot, my opponent is against people who love each other being able to formalize that union?
I think
all of that kind of rhetoric, which is garbage, but that's the kind of stuff that comes out in one of these campaigns.
Interesting.
So I think it's going to be there.
Do you think it's going to be a main thrust or an ancillary one?
I think they'll do focus groups. I think they'll do polling. I think they'll do selected audiences. They'll figure out who does this move, and that's where the message will go. That's the way campaigns are run these days.
I want to just ask about a couple of people. One is Greg Harris, who was the openly gay legislator, one of a few now in the General Assembly, who was the chief sponsor of this in the House, who drew some ire from some in the cause who are on his side because he didn't call it for a vote back in the spring, but he said, come back in November, we'll get it done, and ultimately they did. And Speaker Madigan, who is a Catholic and talked about it on the floor and raised the issue of what the new Pope has talked about, being more open to other folks and gay people. We don't, who am I to condemn? I think, and Speaker Madigan said that on the floor, which I'm sure did not make the Catholic Conference, which is still strongly opposed to this, angry. But Madigan turned some votes at the end, and Harris played kind of the waiting game that turned to be the effective way to go. Did he not?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Harris handled it well. If he didn't have the votes for it in the spring, there was no reason to call the bill. I know some of the supporters thought that, well, let's get a roll call to see who's for and who's against. And putting people out that way on a controversial issue when you don't have the votes is not smart strategy. And Speaker Madigan did play a significant role in this, as he does in a lot of situations.
Which is interesting, because in many circles he's everybody's favorite villain. But if you are for this issue, he turned the screws as necessary with the kind of pressure that's needed to get it done at the end.
Yeah, and that's one of the, I find, interesting things. The people who criticize Madigan criticize him when he doesn't do what they want him to do, and that he's a tyrant, he's blocking the people's will from being accomplished. But when it's something they want to happen, then he's a visionary leader because he agrees with us, and he should be using his clout and his influence to push our agenda ahead.
Yeah, I do think it's noteworthy that he gave a floor speech on it. I mean, he could have moved those votes without getting into it himself publicly, and I'm not sure how to interpret that, but I do think there's some significance to the fact that he gave that speech on the floor.
He never, over the years, he just doesn't speak often, so when he does, people tend to perk up and listen. Bruce, out and about in town, what do people think of this? You think, is there a...
Well, one thing, I'm going to take it away from Springfield here for a second, if I could. There were a lot of elections on Tuesday night, and I was reading some of the coverage in the Washington Post of all things, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and Seattle got a new mayor, Ed Murray, and so the Washington Post was talking about, well, geez, this is like the first, this is 3 or 4 times in a row where an incumbent mayor in Seattle has been tossed out, and the very last line of the story was, oh, by the way, Ed Murray's gay. I mean, it's just not my, I guess, I don't have a perfect prognosticator or crystal ball here, but I really do think that this is an issue that I think it really is a civil rights issue of our time, and it's in some ways you can see parallels between what's happening now with gay rights and the civil rights movements of the 60s, and 20 years is a long time to talk about anything. And I think that at this point in time, I don't know that this is an issue that folks are really, it's going to move a lot of folks electorally. I think that it's kind of it's one of these issues that are a hot button issue for a lot of folks: guns, abortion, that sort of thing. You've made up your mind about this for a long time, and I think what's different about this issue, as opposed to those issues, is that I think we've seen an evolution of thinking about this. Minds have really changed over the years, and I think that's a good and a healthy thing. I think that anybody, and again, I could be completely wrong, I often am, but I think anybody that really tries to use this as an issue at the polls as a main issue is going to be perceived as desperate, and this is and perhaps rightfully so.
Well, I will say that just based on the rally that I saw and the intensity in the rotunda at that time, and with certain areas in the state, I think it still is an intense issue some places. I don't know what can be done about it, but I think somebody might get beat over it, but we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I think the thing to keep in mind, I largely agree with you, Bruce, but the thing to keep in mind here, and Bernie has alluded to it, is that the people who are vehemently opposed to this legislation will be motivated.
They're going to work it
in their votes. Now, how that plays out, I don't know. Or we'll see if there are primary elections. We'll see how the general election plays out. The people who are for this legislation, particularly those who are not deeply involved in getting it passed, they're going to be looking at other issues in the election. Although again, and there's a repetition here, I do think the economy, jobs, taxes, with most voters, so those are going to be the main issues in the election.
Well, and there's a possibility that this issue may come up again in that under the rules for when legislation that's passed can become effective, because this occurred during the veto session, even though the governor will sign it in a matter of days, I guess, it won't really become effective until the 1st of June. And so there was legislation filed by Senator Don Harmon, an Oak Park Democrat, that would change the date to earlier, and that legislation is intended to be passed after January 1st.
Because then it could become immediately effective.
It could become immediately effective with a simple majority.
Right. I would just say,
and so were that bill to come up, that would be another opportunity for a roll call that could be used for or against people.
yeah, I'm guessing weddings take a long time to plan. I'm guessing they might not call that one just to not have the trouble again, but I don't know. We should say
as
before.
he expressed it, though, it was kind of up to what would you say, the supporters of the bill. Should we try and get an earlier effective date or a later effective date?
We'll see. I will mention a couple of things. Another, I think he's a freshman, or maybe his second term, but Sam Yingling of Round Lake Beach up in northern Illinois is an openly gay legislator, and at apparently the celebration party after this House vote at the governor's mansion, he proposed to his partner. They have a couple of sons, and the governor was there. It was on videotape, or tape that some people, it's nothing is, videotape, or digital video that people could watch later. So that was one kind of interesting, happy result. He presented a ring, and they're now engaged for whenever it happens. But Naomi Jacobson was the other story that we mentioned at the beginning of the show. And I don't know if someone wants to recount, or I can, but she's a legislator from Champaign, or Urbana. She had a son with an illness, an adult son, who apparently was in hospice care. She's a supporter of the bill, found out that her vote was needed. She drove from Champaign to Springfield to vote, and then went home, and her son died that day as well. So,
yeah, she'd been at his bedside for for a week or more, knowing that the end was imminent, and she left his bedside to come to Springfield and cast the vote.
It's the kind of story that made some news and tugs at your heartstrings, and we move forward. But she said I saw her quoted as saying that she thought he would have wanted her to be here to do that. Just going to briefly talk about pensions. I mentioned at the opening of the show, it's the big issue, the $100 billion in unfunded liability in the future that legislators are still working on, but they did not get to it during the veto session. They get some criticism from the public for that, but I guess there's some chance, if an agreement is reached soon, that they would come back for a special session day before the end of the year, around Thanksgiving time. But we don't know. Any word on that, or should they be chastised by the public, as your old paper, the Sun-Times, did in an editorial, Charlie?
No, I don't think they should be chastised. But I'm one of the few people in the state of Illinois who agrees with Senator Cullerton that this is not the imminent crisis that everybody portrays it to be, for a couple of reasons. One, our unfunded liability is about $100 billion, which is a lot of money. On the other hand, that money never has to be paid all at once. It's ongoing, and there is money coming in all the time from the contributions that people in the retirement systems make with every paycheck. That money is getting invested and earning a return. So it's not like if we don't do something this week, everything will blow up. It's a longer range problem. There are a couple of problems that are more immediate, which, if you want, we could talk about.
Well, we know that there's $112 million that, is that one of the ones that the back pay to retire to
and there's the
employees?
billions of dollars that we owe people who already provided us goods and services. This isn't money that we're going to have to pay at some point in the future decades. This is money that's already due and owing that we can't cover. And to me, the most imminent crisis is the fact that when Governor Quinn presents his budget next spring, he has to present a budget that will deal with a loss of more than $2 billion in revenue because of the scheduled expiration of the current tax rates on January 1st of 2015, midway through the FY15 budget year. And by law, he has to present a budget showing how he's going to deal with having $2 billion less to spend.
Yeah, and it's going to be in the middle of a campaign, so if he says he
Yeah,
wants to
that's going
extend
to be,
the
to me,
income
that's
tax,
that's
that's-
a much bigger problem than how are we going to fund, my pension should I ever decide to retire, because I'm in the state employees or state university retirement system, or some teacher's retirement who's 30 years old now is going to retire a quarter of a century from now or 40 years from now.
Well, I generally defer to Charlie on fiscal issues, and I agree it's not something that has to be solved today or tomorrow. But I do think it's got to be resolved sooner or later. Now, Charlie can give a very rational explanation of this. The fact is that businesses seeking to locate or expand in Illinois do not like uncertainty about the fiscal situation, and so they're going to be reluctant to invest here, in my view. That's going to be a problem in job creation until it gets resolved one way or the other.
so they know what the
Yeah.
what the tax structure on the pensions.
Yeah,
will
I
be.
mean-
and the bond rating for the state, so it's borrowing. So we.
Perception is reality, and right now, in the political and governmental world, and right now there's a perception in the business community that there's a huge unknown out there.
Right. Okay. I'm going to quickly.
No, I just wonder whether the timing of this feeds the case for a progressive tax to replace this tax that's due to expire. I think it's a lot easier for Quinn, if need be, to say to campaign on let's tax the folks that can best afford it, as opposed to let's continue.
And
this
that would
other
take a
one.
constitutional amendment. The Democrats might put it on the ballot, but I don't think it would win in this climate. But one never knows. But you could campaign on that, and there's a strong opposition to that. One of the groups that's opposed to that, and is strongly opposed to that, is a group called the Illinois Policy Institute.
I'm glad you brought them up.
Well, this is awkward for me because I wrote a column about the Illinois Policy Institute, and Bruce encouraged me before the show to talk about it. So
Yes,
here
I thought
And
it was some.
The situation is the Illinois Policy Institute has grown from a startup, liberty-based, nonpartisan, quote-unquote group that started maybe 10 years ago in town. It has now grown to something more than, I think, 30 staffers, Chicago office, Springfield office, strongly anti-tax. They promoting a 401k style plan for pensions. And it turns out, and I just found out by asking and then finally getting an answer from the campaign, that Bruce Rushton, one of the 4 candidates for governor on the Republican side, has donated in the last 5 years $500,000 or more, he said, more than $500,000, this person said, to the Policy Institute. And what I wrote about was that the Policy Institute also has a new offshoot called the Illinois News Network, which they are peddling as news that newspapers can use for free. They are talking about the issues that are important to them and have reporters that they say are unbiased and unattached and don't get Bruce Rauner's money, but it's all part of the same process, so I'm going to let Bruce talk about it now.
Well, yeah, I mean, and kudos to Bernie. I thought it was a real solid piece of work, and one of the reasons why it's so good, I thought, is that to my knowledge, this is the first time where anybody has identified solidly where the Illinois Policy Institute is getting its money. Not all of its money, but a good chunk of it. And we still don't know exactly how much they're getting, because, as you rightly say, it's more than $500,000. $10 million is more than $500,000.
I'm assuming it was
We're
close to that.
assuming it's close, but I'd like to
I
get a
don't
more
know.
precise price tag. But more importantly, I think that this really puts the media, newspapers, under the gun, so to speak, in that I don't see myself how a newspaper at this point in time could run any story from the Illinois Policy Institute's news arm about the gubernatorial election with a straight face. It just doesn't pass the sniff test, unless you have something like a paid advertisement disclaimer on top. That's probably a little over the top, but it's just this is, I thought, my own opinion. This really helps crystallize why identifying funding is important for groups like the Illinois Policy Institute, particularly those that are putting out news stories that are being published by news outlets, which are now fairly stressed to come up with news product of their own.
Well, they argue also that they have a columnist who is doing opinion and says that he's, the journalist in residence from the Policy Institute. They also say that groups like, I guess, George Soros funds, other groups fund journalism enterprises. So I don't know. Charlie, you were quoted in the column. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and I think what I said in the column was that I look at all of this so-called news reporting done by these advocacy groups as just being part of advancing their agenda, and I have no problem with that. I mean, I think if you have positions on issues, you should be out there trying to sell them to other people. I guess my bigger beef would be the newspaper editors who run this stuff without a disclaimer, saying that this was prepared by
Like Illinois News Network.
by whoever the organization is, which has a definite point of view, and so we run it as an op-ed column. And I think that's great. The more opinions there are is healthy for democracy, but it shouldn't be masqueraded as being objective, factual, unbiased, balanced reporting.
And to coin a phrase, it's transparency, stupid. And, and I guess if you go to the history of journalism, back in the 19th century, there were a lot more newspapers around, but everybody wore their politics on the sleeve. I mean, there was the Republican or the Whig even publication, and then there was the opposition. But everybody knew who this was, and it's a different playing field now, and hopefully there will be more disclosure.
Okay, unfortunately we're going to have to end it there. Thank you all. Mike Lawrence, Charlie Wheeler, Bruce Rushton, it's been fun talking, as usual. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.